Good evening, everyone. It's good to be here, and it's good to be here with Susan, one of my most admired women in journalism. She is the gold standard on political reporting, and you know, all of the work that you've done. You've interviewed 10 American presidents yourself. You know, you've reported from 6 continents, and now she's done a deep dive about the intersection of global royalty and the Oval Office. This is, I think, such an interesting subject. You, of course, those of us from San Francisco know you have written the book about Nancy Pelosi and her...
Perhaps you've heard of her.
her political power and how she wielded it. Barbara Bush, Barbara Walters. So you've written about so many formidable women, American women. What took you across the pond? What was it about Queen Elizabeth that got you interested in taking on this incredible project?
So, Carla, I'm from Washington, so I'm going to ignore your question and just say what I want. Perhaps you've seen this technique. I want to say how pleased I am to be at the Commonwealth Club. This is my 4th book, with my first time at the Commonwealth Club, so I'm honored to be here, and especially with the legendary Carla, speaking of the gold standard of political journalist. I think when I started the Nancy Pelosi book, I believe you might have been the first person I interviewed. I flew here and we had, you may finish off a bottle of wine.
I think we did, yes.
And talked about Nancy Pelosi. So I wasn't like a particular fangirl for the royals or for Queen Elizabeth, but when she died, and I was reading these obits, when she died in 2022, the obits would say, and she met with 13 sitting presidents, period. And there was like not a second sentence there, like what they talk about. Was it just all social chit chat? Were there consequences of the fact that she met with so many U.S. presidents? I've interviewed 10 presidents, but 3 of them, after they had left office, they weren't sitting then. I thought that was a lot of presidents. There's only one other person in the history of the world who has met with as many sitting presidents as Queen Elizabeth, and that was Helen Keller.
Wow.
I know.
Wow.
Interesting. Possible another book. I don't know.
Yeah.
So what struck me as possibly interesting for a book would be what she did, what consequences she had. And I was trying to, before you actually embark on a book, you try to figure out if there's a book there. And I found in Bill Clinton's memoir this quote from him after he met Queen Elizabeth for the first time as president at a big formal state dinner with many foreign leaders marking the 50th anniversary of D-Day. And he said this, he said, were it not for the circumstances of her birth, she could have been a successful diplomat or politician, but as it was, she had to be both without seeming to be either. And it was really, think what you will about Bill Clinton, he is really perceptive about people. And I thought it was the single most perceptive observation I found about her, because she turned out to be quite consequential in big ways, in ways that were almost never acknowledged or recognized because they were so thoroughly behind the scenes. So that's why I did this book.
But you with the book with Nancy Pelosi and Barbara Bush, you had extensive interview access. You had a lot of records to go through. Queen Elizabeth, as you write about, was famously tight with any kind of personal view. You didn't get to sit down with her. As a reporter, what were the challenges in writing a book where you never got to sit down with the actual subject, and she was very close about her own personal opinions?
So this is a big debate among biographers, I've discovered, having become a late-in-life biographer, and that is, are you better off with a subject that's dead or alive? Now, there are trade-offs, because with someone who's alive, you can interview them. And I interviewed Nancy Pelosi 11 times for that book, and I interviewed Barbara Bush once a month for 6 months, the last 6 months of her life for that book. And so that's a big advantage. On the other hand, if they're dead, they cannot complain about what you write about them, which has its upsides too. Queen Elizabeth never wrote a memoir. She essentially never did an interview. She kept a diary her whole life. She kept it in pencil. Do you think that's odd?
Wow.
I mean, wouldn't you have kept it in pen? I was interviewing someone who was whose father was a top aide to the Queen, and I said, I hope that someday they release her diaries. Can you imagine what her diaries must be like? And he said, yes, we hope her diaries would be amazing, but we fear it may be something like, it's Tuesday. I had soup for lunch and fed the corgis. And that it would not be sort of shot through with the brilliant observations and insights we would hope to have. But yes, this was a problem. And while I had, having covered Washington for so long, I had pretty good sources on this side of the Atlantic. And that's why this book, I think, had not been done. There are lots of great biographies of Queen Elizabeth, but they're by British people who don't have sources in the deep sources in Washington and a sense of our politics. So the portrayal of a relationship with U.S. presidents, I thought, was always a little off, even in the very good biographies of her. So I interviewed Trump and Obama and Clinton and Biden for this book, and I interviewed a lot of them, first ladies and secretaries of state and so on. But it was harder to get the Brits. I did end up with 3 British prime ministers who had dealt, obviously with the Queen, and so they were good. But the fact, going back to the question, dead or alive, the fact that she was dead was a big help in terms of, perhaps that sounds wrong. But it was a big help in terms of getting people to talk to me, including British officials, because she was dead. They were a little more open, and especially the U.S. presidents were more willing to talk about what she told them, their private conversations, than they had ever been while she was still alive.
Yeah. Well, over 70 years, you talk about sitting down with 13 sitting presidents. Her first introduction to someone who would be a future president was with JFK when she was an adolescent. Can you talk a little bit about that meeting and how it might have influenced their later meetings in life?
So this was one of the challenges of writing the book. The first draft I wrote was like a chapter on JFK and a chapter on LBJ. And the problem was that presidents keep popping up at all different stages of their lives with Queen Elizabeth. That's just the kind of life she had. And so I had to do then a second draft that just was more directly chronological and not, there are still chapters that tend to be devoted to one president or another, but JFK is a great example. She is 12 years old. Her father is just 2 years on the throne. And she goes to tea with her grandmother, the Queen Mother, and the tea is with the son of the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain, who is Joseph Kennedy Sr. And JFK at that point is 21. He's a senior at Harvard. He's kind of bopping around Europe before World War II breaks out. And he writes a letter after this tea. He writes at Buckingham Palace. He writes a letter to his friend Lynn Billings, with whom he had a very active correspondence. And he said, I had tea today with the Queen Mother and Princess Elizabeth, with whom I made a great deal of time. Now, what in the world does that mean? And finally in the book I say, I have no idea what this means. I mean, I think it was some boastful nothing, between young men. But that was her first encounter with someone who would become president. So she met other presidents before they became president as well. And then she had continuing friendships with just a few presidents after they left office.
Yeah. And you talk about with her first sort of big meeting with Truman, which I think is fascinating because he actually committed a protocol error, and one of many that we'll see along over the decades. But
so there's a rule with royals, and I'm sure all of you have met many royals in your life, and it's that you don't touch them. Like you don't even shake their hand unless they extend their hand to you first. And Americans are unable to abide by this rule of protocol. We're just kind of a huggy people, I guess, to the alarm and dismay of the British press that is constantly making comments about how gauche we are as a people, and we're constantly pawing the Queen. And this starts with Truman. Elizabeth is still a princess at that point. She hasn't become queen yet. She comes for her first visit to the United States, and she gets off the plane at National Airport and is so nervous that Truman is afraid she won't be able to speak. Because this trip, which also included a long time in Canada, extended trip in Canada, was designed to kind of get her sea legs for the role that she was going to assume sooner than they thought, whenever her father passed away, which was just a few years later. And so she gets off the plane, and there's a press corps there, and they're carrying it live on radio as far west as Omaha. Not because Omaha is special, but that's as far as you could carry radio live at that point. Yeah. And Truman takes her arm and says, "Don't be nervous, dear. You're going to be all right. We just want to hear what you have to say." He talks about this in an oral history that I found. And she steadies herself, and she then there's a newsreel of her then delivering the prepared remarks that she had in that wonderful British accent, in that precise, clear voice. But the headlines in the British press were, "Truman touches princess and calls her dear," and it's like he had tackled her to the ground. They were so alarmed, but the person who almost never seemed alarmed by the way Americans were was the Queen.
You talk about with Truman, he almost saw her as kind of a daughter.
Yes.
With Eisenhower, similar. I mean, almost like a granddaughterly approach. But of course, he was a war hero. Yeah. You said that he was the one who taught her the importance of soft power.
Yeah.
What was her relationship with Eisenhower like?
First, let me tell you how they met.
Yeah.
She's 16. Eisenhower has finally been sent over to command Allied forces. The United States to the rescue. Britain was really in very sorry shape then in the war against the Nazis. And Eisenhower came over on an early trip to kind of survey the landscape and wanted to go see Windsor Castle. And the king agreed. King George agreed, Elizabeth's father. And said, "And we'll stay in our apartments so they can take a tour, and there won't be the awkwardness of meeting, and that's supposed to be a more formal occasion." But then King George forgets that he's made this promise. So King George and Queen Elizabeth I and Elizabeth and Margaret and two of their friends are having tea on a terrace at Windsor Castle when they hear this British guide who managed the garden giving a tour to Eisenhower and another American general coming along the way. And King George says, "Oh no, I forgot, I promised to stay out of the way." And the king and queen dive under the table. And there's a tablecloth that goes down to the floor around this table. They dive under the table, so do the two princesses, so do the two friends, not quite sure what to do. They huddle under the table, giggling, with all the tea service on the top, and the generals walk by, and after the generals were gone, they came back. That tells you a lot about King George. So her relationship with Eisenhower, he was a hero to her and Britons generally, and really had a close relationship with her father, King George. And what surprised her when she came here in 1956, in her first visit, in 1957, right, in her first visit to the United States as sovereign, was that Eisenhower, who was president, did not treat her like the daughter of a friend, did not treat her like a 16-year-old princess. He wanted to hear what she had to say. She had a point of view that he wanted to listen to, and when she went back to London afterwards, she told friends what a surprise this was to her, how much regard he had for her. And it taught her something about the soft power that she would then wield for the rest of her life.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
It was a time it was after the Suez Crisis, where Britain and France and Israel had conspired to take over the Suez Canal from the Egyptians, despite Eisenhower telling them not to do it. They did it. It was a catastrophe. Eisenhower was enraged, and it was an incredibly fraught time in U.S.-British relations. And he basically cut off cooperation with the British and the Eisenhower administration. And when the Queen came here, they didn't, so far as I can tell, they didn't talk about Suez. They talked about other things. They kind of reasserted the long friendship between the two countries and how much it had mattered.
Right.
And when she left, Suez was in the rearview mirror, and the Eisenhower administration began dealing with the British officials again. That was one of maybe the first example of her really making a difference in a significant way, especially in preserving that special relationship between the two countries.
You also talk about how on her first state visit there under Eisenhower, she just fell in love with the United States, wanted to go to a supermarket, look at frozen pot pies.
In her mink coat.
Yeah. How did she?
They went to the Giant, I don't know, the Giant in suburban Maryland. They were going out to a football game at
She wanted to see a football.
She wanted to see, so they didn't stay long at the football game. I don't think she was crazy about the football game. But on the drive out there, she had seen this supermarket, which were not then a thing in England. They had still markets. You go to the butcher and you go to the baker. And so she asked if they could stop at the Giant on their way back. So they call the planners call the Giant manager, who assumes it's a prank and does not come back to work. So the Queen of England drives up in her mink coat, and she and Prince Philip have this, it's like they're in an amusement park. They cannot believe the frozen pot pies they talk about endlessly. And they were giving out cheese on little trays. They thought that was wonderful, little cheese sample. And it was really an introduction to something that was common in the United States, but was new to Britain then.
And she also gave Eisenhower her drop scone recipe, which I thought that was hysterical.
So he later visited, toward the end of his second term, he visited her at Windsor Castle, a great honor for a president to be invited there, because that's in the Scottish Highlands. It's where they relax in the summer. And one of the things she'd like to do there was to have what amounts to like a barbecue, where she would do some of the cooking. And she made these drop scones on the outdoor griddle and promised them to Eisenhower. And at the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas, they pulled out this recipe card that the Queen had sent Eisenhower. They keep it very protected. It's all smudged. It's in her handwriting. It's like this much flour, this much baking powder, stir it together, drop it, don't beat it too hard. But it's like to make 54 scones. Like it's like a regal amount of scones, which she apologizes for. No evidence that Eisenhower actually ever made the griddle scones, but it was something he had admired of hers when they were.
There's a real relationship. Okay, so one thing I think we all want to know is, and I want you to get your questions ready because I'm going to give you some time to ask Susan too, her favorite president.
Yeah.
Okay, come on.
So now, don't you think probably every president wondered, especially the later ones, wondered who her favorite president was? But only one president asked her. Who do you think? Who? Trump. And who told me this? Trump. So he was he had this state dinner that he had so wanted to have. He just adored the Queen. Trump told me one of his earliest childhood memories was he's 6 years old. He's seated next to his mother on a couch at their home in Queens, New York, watching her coronation. His mother had been born in Scotland, was a big fan of the royal family in general and Elizabeth in particular. So the state dinner was very, very important to Trump. And he's told me, along with not trying to touch the Queen, you're not supposed to relate what it is she tells you. But he paid no attention to that. Thank goodness for the book. And so he tells me, he goes, so I'm Trump and you'll be, I'll play both parts because you don't know. So he says, so tell me, who was your favorite president? And she says, oh, they were all so wonderful, I couldn't possibly choose. And he says, wasn't Reagan your favorite president? No, they were all. What about Nixon? Oh, yes, Nixon was glorious. So she, this did not, in fact, reflect her views, but she very deftly refuses to answer the question, which Trump admired very much, her ability to dodge a question without causing offense. He said that was not a skill he had. But he told me that while Queen Elizabeth wouldn't tell him who her favorite president was, that he was later given to understand by others that she did have a favorite president, and it was him. Now, after spending about 3 years on this book, I can report that I do not think this is true. I think her favorite president, or the president that she felt closest to and liked the most, was Reagan. And there's one big reason why. Horses. I mean, they had a wonderful friendship. They really did, and they enjoyed each other's company. And you can tell how much she liked presidents by whether she tried to see them again. And she and the Reagans had quite a few experiences together. And when Reagan left office, they continued a correspondence, which was not true with every president. And when I was out at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, I'm sure many of you have been there, they brought out these handwritten letters, handwritten on her part, typed on his part, of their correspondence after he was president. So they're not really part of the presidential archives. They're separate papers that are kept there because they're post-presidential. And it's like 90% of them, the conversation is about their horses. I went riding. Have you gone riding? I fell off my horse and hit my wrist, but it wasn't the horse's fault. I heard your horse died. I am so very sorry about the death of your horse. There's almost nothing about their children, but there is quite a bit about their horses. And I think that she and Reagan had a true friendship. And her second favorite president was a big surprise. Who do you think her second favorite president was? See, have you read the book, The Queen and Her Presidents? Because, in fact, it is Obama. Why do you say that?
Yeah.
Michelle.
Yeah. That's really perceptive.
Yeah.
And you should write a book. Because when Obama was elected, there was some nervousness on both sides of the Atlantic that they weren't going to get along. Because Obama did not have any special truck with the special relationship. He was focused more on Asia. He'd been born in Hawaii. He'd spent part of his childhood in Indonesia. He thought the United States policy toward Asia should take a bigger role. Also, the only the only intersection between their two families was that her colonial government had put his grandfather in prison in Kenya.
Wow.
Which is maybe not the best start of a new friendship. But when they met, they just instantly got along. And it was another example of those oafish Americans when there was a reception. This is the first time they've met. They'd met at a tea that went very well. And then they went to this reception where there was press. And during this reception, Michelle Obama and the Queen are talking about how much their feet hurt. And Michelle Obama is showing the heels of her Jimmy Choos that are making her feet hurt. And she puts up her heel like this. I'm not wearing heels, but
Yeah.
She puts her hand on the Queen's back. And again, it's Truman all over again. It's like she put her hand on the Queen's back. And then the Queen put her hand on Michelle's waist, which the newspaper accounts in Britain said had never happened before.
Wow.
I know. And this became an incredible furor. And Michelle Obama told me that she was actually concerned it was going to have like political repercussions against her husband. But once again, the person who seemed the least concerned about that was the Queen. And when toward the end of Obama's second term, they very much wanted to have the Queen come for a state visit in Washington, but she was in her 90s and she was no longer making long trips like that. So they swung by. He was on another foreign trip. They swung by and stopped in England to have lunch with her. And the day after her 90th birthday, to celebrate her birthday. You can do this if you're president.
Wow.
You got a plane, and it can be over in some other continent, and you can swing by and go to lunch in London, and no one thinks anything of it. And it was also a sign, like the letters about the horses, it was also a sign of how much they liked each other. And there was this terrible security issue then, because they were landing at Windsor, and Prince Philip, who was then 94 years old, wanted to drive the car of them going to the castle. And Prince Philip was not considered, had never been considered a good driver. He had had a series of accidents, and now he was 94 years old. And it had been 8 years, or a little more than that. It had been more than 8 years since Obama had been in a car not being driven by a Secret Service agent. And the Secret Service was unenthusiastic about the president getting in the car with Prince Philip driving, and it became a thing. And the Queen said, "It's my home, it's my turf. My husband wants to drive, he'll drive." and the White House gave in. And this is another one of those protocol things. So the deal was they were going to get in this Land Rover. And Michelle Obama was to sit in the front with Prince Philip, and President Obama was to sit in the back with Queen Elizabeth, because that's what protocol said they should do. And they drilled this into the Obamas and Michelle Obama especially, did not want to make another gaffe, because the first one, putting her hand on the Queen's back, had become such a big issue. And so they were she said she was very, very focused that she was going to sit in the front with Prince Philip. And if you watch the news footage, you can't hear what they're saying, but they seem to be circling the car. Yeah. And that's because the Queen is saying to Michelle, "Come sit back here with me." And Michelle is frozen with fear that she's been told she's supposed to sit in the front. And they're like this, it's like they're doing this dance and no one will get in the car. And the Queen finally said, "Did they tell you couldn't sit in the back with me?" And Michelle said, "Yes." And the Queen said, "Never mind, come sit." And so finally she gets in the car.
But you tell a story about a pin that Michelle Obama bought. Can you tell this story? Because I think it really goes to how much respect they had for each other.
Yeah. I've got to say, when you're a reporter, and Carla will know this, there are times during an interview where someone says something that is so delicious that it's like a chill goes up your back. And you try very hard to keep a poker face so the person doesn't know they've just thrilled you. So that's how I felt when I first heard this story. So the Obamas at that first visit, they brought gifts. President Obama bought a gift, maybe the worst gift ever, second worst of a presidential gift, which was an iPod loaded with his speeches. Okay? Seriously. Right? Really? And Michelle Obama, he was new to the job.
Really?
Michelle Obama went down to a place called the Little Jewelry Box in downtown D.C. I don't know if any of you have been there. It's like a really fancy it used to be little, now it's big. She went down there and she bought a small pin that had little jewels in it. And I thought that was also an odd gift for the Queen of England, who has the crown jewels, and maybe. But anyway, at least it wasn't an iPod loaded with her favorite speeches that she herself had given. So she presents it to the Queen. The Queen thanks her, and at the reciprocal dinner the next night, the Queen wears it, which meant a lot to the Obamas. She doesn't wear it again for 7 years because she has, other jewelry that she can wear. Then on the day that Donald Trump arrives in England for the first time as president, she's having a meeting with two world religious leaders, and they come out to have their picture taken, and there is the Obama pin. I know.
Ooh.
So this is possibly a reason I think that President Trump is incorrect when he says he was It's like a message by jewelry.
I was going to say, was it a message?
Oh, it was a message by jewelry.
Exactly. Wow.
I know.
That's very amazing. Well, go a little more to the Trump meetings with her, because when you talk about protocol too, there were a couple of very obvious and headline-making events with him where he cuts her off at one point. How go to the Trump meetings and some of the difficulties.
So I thought you were going to ask me a different question, which is if we talked about her favorite president.
Yeah. Oh, we want to get there too. Yeah,
the
want to go there first.
President?
Yeah.
Okay, but first the Trump protocol.
Yeah.
Actually, so Trump at the first visit, they're going to review the troops. And maybe you saw the footage because really the British go crazy about how stupid Americans are, especially American presidents. In this time, Trump is supposed to walk beside the Queen. And one of the things, along with not touching them, you're not supposed to turn your back to the Queen. although you are now allowed to walk out of a room turning around. It used to be you have to back up. And so, but Trump gets a little discombobulated and ends up standing in front of the Queen and blocks her from camera view entirely because she's pretty tiny. You know, she was 5'4", and by then she was shorter than she was 5'4" in her prime. And if you look at the footage, she's like, she like disappears from view. He's standing there waiting to review the troops. And you see her hat kind of pop over this way and then come around this way, and she comes around. And this was seen as a great faux pas on Trump's part. Although one of the British palace officials I interviewed said that it was the first time she was reviewing the troops because it was something Prince Philip had always done.
Yeah.
And he had just retired from public life and found someplace else to be when Trump was visiting. And he said that the Queen had not handled it in the smooth way that Prince Philip was. And he also said that that night when she saw it on the telly, that she laughed out loud.
Didn't he keep her waiting at one point, though? I remember where she like looked at her watch. Are there any other moments like that?
You know, he
Yeah.
he was very proud that their meeting went long. Their first tea. This was in 2018. They had the state dinner was in 2019. This was in 2018. And one of the reasons Trump said that the Queen liked him so much was that this meeting went well over the 20 minutes it was scheduled to go. Mm-hmm. Although some of the British officials said that the person doing most of the talking was him, not her. Although that is also a technique.
Yeah. But I understand you reported that Trump told you he bombarded the Queen with questions about Harry and Meghan.
Can you imagine?
That seems a little personal. How did that go over?
So she insisted that everything was great.
Of course.
And she didn't bite him. One can only imagine what she thought about this line of questioning at the state dinner.
Yeah.
He asked for favorite president, favorite prime ministers, and what's the deal with Harry and Meghan.
Whoa.
That would have been great to have a recording going.
Okay, so let's go to her least favorite president.
So who do you think is her least favorite president? All wrong. Jimmy Carter.
Ooh.
I know. Now, Jimmy Carter, of course, very admirable figure. Let's just specify that. Did a lot of good with Habitat for Humanity and disease eradication and many things as a former president. But the first time he went to England as president, very new in his presidency, he went to a big dinner at Buckingham Palace. It included other G7 leaders. There was a G7 summit there then. And he was seated as the U.S. president between the Queen and the Queen Mother, a position of the highest honor. And he had, apparently, he was very taken by they're quite grand, these dinners. And they close with Scottish pipers circling the room. And it's really, it's really quite the thing. And he gets up to leave, and he's saying goodbye to the royal family. And you remember the first rule with the royal family? Don't touch. So he leans in to kiss the Queen Mother on the cheek, which she doesn't expect because no one dares do that. And she turns her head, and he kisses her smack on the lips.
Oh, ouch.
And she never stopped complaining about it. And she would give, at private dinners, she would give what's called an anti-toast. You know how a toast is someone you honor and respect? An anti-toast would be the reverse. And it's reported that at one of these dinners, she gave 3 anti-toasts. One was to an anti-monarchist, the leading anti-monarchist in British politics. One was to Idi Amin, who deserved an anti-toast, and the third was to Jimmy Carter, who was, she said, the only man since her dear, beloved husband had died who had dared to kiss her on the lips. And if you want to know that this left an impression, he was never invited back.
Oh.
But with the Queen, with the Queen, we talked before. There's some challenges with the Queen because I couldn't interview her, but you could watch what she did, not what she said. She didn't say that much, and what she did often told you a lot, like the Obama pin, and the never inviting Jimmy Carter back. This story rankled Jimmy Carter, and when he was 90 years old, he wrote his 30th book. And in his book, he denies that it ever took place.
Ooh.
And he blames it on the handiest target for everybody, the press. But I interviewed his Evan Dobell, who was his chief of protocol, who was standing there, who told me it did indeed happen.
Okay.
There's another great Carter story. I said that the Obama iPod was the second worst present that anyone had given the Queen. Carter gave her the worst. And that was... It was her silver jubilee. And so American presidents are supposed to send a gift to the Queen of England to celebrate her silver jubilee. But Carter was kind of cheap. And he didn't, for whatever reason, he sent Evan Dobell, his chief of protocol, into, do you have like a closet where you put gifts you don't like and you can recycle? I have one of those. The White House has one of those too. And they sent Evan Dobell down to I'm sure it's a warehouse full of things that presidents can give away or things that they got that they could recycle. And Evan Dobell found these sets of Winslow Homer plates. These are plates that have Winslow Homer, reproductions of Winslow Homer paintings on them in a little mahogany case. With a seal at the top, a Nixon presidential seal. These are plates that Nixon had ordered, 36 of them, 36 sets of Winslow Homer plates, so that he could give them away during the bicentennial. But of course, he was no longer in a position to give away gifts at the bicentennial because by then he had been forced out of office. So these 36 sets of Winslow Homer plates were in the White House regifting closet. And they decided this would be a great gift for the silver jubilee of the Queen, except that it had a Nixon White House medallion on the top, at the top of the wooden box. So they took a Carter medallion and glued it on top of the Nixon medallion and sent it to the Queen, Happy Jubilee. And you can tell that the Queen was not impressed by it because the Queen writes all presidents all the time, Happy 4th of July, I hope you enjoyed your birthday. But the thank you note for the Winslow Homer plates did not come from the Queen. It came from her secretary, which I'm not sure that Jimmy Carter understood was meant as a message.
That's a good story. What about Nixon? I find because of his political problems, I understand, as Watergate was going on,
Yeah,
you read about this, he kind of wanted
desperately
to have, a meeting or state dinner with her. And the other interesting anecdote you talk about is he's so impressed by the pageantry and so forth that he wants to he ordered elaborate European style white and gold uniforms.
You remember
for
these?
White?
They put the Secret Service guards in them outside the White House. They look like movie ushers, but it's because he wanted some of that glamour. I think he couldn't understand why he couldn't get some of that royal magic. It was the subject of so much ridicule that they stopped making the guards wear them, and they later sold them as government surplus to a marching band in Iowa, which is better suited for them. Nixon and the Queen actually had a good relationship and a lot of contact with each other. Met when he was senator from California. As vice president, he met with her several times, did several things with her. But when Watergate happened, he was desperate to get an invitation for a state dinner, a state visit to England, because it would show that despite the scandal, he was respected around the world, that the most famous and respected woman in the world still wanted to toast him at a fancy dinner. And the Queen was equally determined not to invite him. Because for one thing, he was tainted by scandal, and she avoided that. That happened again during the Clinton administration. For another thing, she wanted to protect her relationship with whoever followed Nixon. And she didn't, so she was very determined not to invite him, but they were worried about saying no to the U.S. president. And in the extensive back and forth in the British archives about this, one of the British ambassador to the United States at one point writes, he can be a vengeful man. So they did not want to say no, but they didn't want to say yes. And in their archives, there's all this calculation about how they can not say yes, but not say no. My favorite scheme was they proposed that they figure out the dates that Nixon could possibly make a state visit that year to England. And that they would announce right away, preemptively, that the prime minister was visiting various foreign capitals on those dates. And in this memo, these memos back and forth, they don't even discuss what countries these might be. It could be anywhere. He could go to Greece. He could go to Greenland. Nobody really cared, just so they could say, when the White House said, well, how about July? They could say, oh, unfortunately, the prime minister is going to be somewhere else. And then Nixon finally resigned and solved the problem for them. But that was a sign of how cold-blooded she could be.
Yeah.
Because she and Nixon had worked together, especially when Ted Heath was prime minister. He was not much of didn't care much about the United States. They had a real relationship but she cut him dead when she thought that would serve the interest of her country.
And did Nixon actually try to set up his daughter with Prince Charles?
So I interviewed the two Nixon girls for the book, including Tricia Nixon, who I'd never interviewed before. And I asked her, I said, there's all this talk that your father was trying to set you up with Prince Charles. Was that true? And she expressed astonishment. She said she had never heard that. It could not possibly be true. At the time, she was secretly engaged to Edward Cox, who, by the way, is still her husband. But I believe that Tricia is wrong because her father sent Tricia over for Charles's investiture as the Prince of Wales. He helped orchestrate this visit by Prince Charles and Princess Anne to the White House, where they did all manner of events with the two girls. Julie Nixon was already married. And when Charles came back during the George W. Bush administration, at a meeting in the Oval Office with the Bushes, he said to George W. and Laura Bush, do not try to set up my two sons, William and Harry, with your two daughters, the way Nixon tried to set me up with Tricia.
Oh. There you go. Okay.
Everybody knew but Tricia.
What about her relationship with first ladies? You mentioned that Jacqueline Kennedy covered her as a reporter really early on.
Yeah.
But then later, apparently, maybe was a little bit snobby about the Queen. What was the relationship?
This is another way people pop up in the Queen's life.
Yeah.
So do you know Jacqueline Beauvoir was an inquiring photographer for the Washington Star when she was a young woman, just out of college, and her first inquiring photographer column was during Elizabeth's visit to the United States with Eisenhower, and she went out and said, "Are American girls as pretty as Queen Elizabeth?" And when Elizabeth was the coronation of Elizabeth, the Washington Star sent Jacqueline Beauvoir to London to do columns about it. And then she finally meets her when she's now the young First Lady, comes from this spectacular visit to France, where she charmed all of France, comes to England, and she and the Queen do not get along. And I think one reason is because Queen Elizabeth had always been the beautiful young woman in the room. And now you look at the pictures from that visit, and Jacqueline Kennedy is the young, beautiful woman in the room. And Queen Elizabeth is looking pretty dowdy. and they have a conversation that Jackie Kennedy found was not impressed by. She wasn't impressed by the palace. She didn't like the food. It was nothing was as good as what they had in France. But she said they did have one little connection, which again was horses. The Queen took her on a tour to show some of the big paintings in the palace, and she stops before one that's of course a horse and says, "That's a good horse." And that was something that Jackie Kennedy thought was true. They later became. They later had a better relationship, especially after the assassination of John Kennedy, when Queen Elizabeth arranged for a memorial to him. I don't know if any of you have visited that out of London. A very beautiful memorial to JFK.
I'm going to open up for questions in a few minutes, but just, I mean, those of us who know and certainly have covered Nancy Pelosi here in this area, I'm curious in terms of some of the contrasts. You know, you talk about, you famously describe the intense, lobbying, the full Pelosi, what it was like dealing with her and as a speaker. And then you have the Queen with the hidden hand of diplomacy. I mean, in your view, what's more effective, or what has been more of how do you measure who was more effective in that respect? And I mean, I'm wondering, do you think had the Queen been born 50 years later, would she have? Would there have been a different approach? Or
she's kind of a unique figure, isn't she? I mean, it's tied into the circumstances of her birth, the World War II. It gave such a grounding of her with this whole series of U.S. presidents and with the American people. And her reign then lasts for so long that it's hard for me to imagine anyone, another Queen Elizabeth.
Yeah.
And although I did think King Charles did a very remarkable job on his visit to Washington under some difficult circumstances.
Yeah, recently. Yeah.
But it's hard. The power that Nancy Pelosi has hard power. Or as Speaker had hard power, and she could be terrifying.
Yes, I can attest to that too.
It's very. And the Queen, have you witnessed her terrifying?
Oh yes, yes.
When I was doing the book, my next to last interview with Pelosi, I brought up all the things I'd been afraid to bring up before because I was afraid it meant I wouldn't have another interview, and she was getting more and more pissed off at me about the things I'm asking about things that she didn't really. Want explored in a big way in the book, and it's like she got bigger as we're sitting there, and Nancy Pelosi, like the Queen, not that tall, but it's like she got bigger and bigger and scarier and scarier, and she didn't really raise her voice, but I kind of felt like she was raising her voice. And in this interview, she was saying she didn't understand why I would include that in the book. That was of no importance, and I said, well, I think it was important, and I am going to include it in the book, and that's why I wanted to ask you about it. So I didn't give in, but when I left, I went home. So I left this interview where I'd gotten the full Pelosi. I went home. I got into bed and drank some wine. I watched reruns of Cagney and Lacey, which happened to be what was on TV that afternoon until I could kind of calm down. I can only imagine what it's like to be a member of Congress about whom Pelosi would have had considerable more sway than she did with me as a reporter to get the full Pelosi. I can see why she could get votes. They were both formidable women. They both faced sexism.
Yeah.
I think their accomplishments for each were undervalued. But their manner of exercising power could not be more different.
I mean, do you think you're absolutely right? And the Queen's approach was so different. In an era of social media, I'm just wondering, are we ever going to see someone like her again? It could be the Princess of Wales right now.
Yeah, she's very popular.
And she's kind of has the same approach.
She did have an ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Because one of the only time that the Queen never truly misstepped, I think, but I think there was a point, especially with the death of Princess Di, that she didn't express grief publicly in the way that the British people wanted her to. And it took her a couple days, and she finally did, and she adapted, I think, to that new expectation of the public, and she got looser as she got older. Do you remember when London was the site of the Olympics? And for the opening ceremony, the Queen, they had this funny film about the Queen, and then she parachutes out of a plane.
Yeah, right, yeah.
I have a spoiler alert, that was not actually the Queen. But the fact that she would participate in a gag like that is something she never would have done in the first 40 years of her term.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my last question, then I want to give the audience a chance to ask. I mean, is this the approach that she took? Or is that the end of an era, really? Where with King Charles, he seems to kind of be following in his mother's footsteps. But what we saw with her was,
and she just the length of tenure,
70 years, right?
70 years, and meeting with world leaders. Is there a world leader she didn't meet with? So really quite remarkable. But I will say for King Charles, he comes, his trip here, his first trip, and maybe his last trip as king to the United States, reminded me of her first trip to the United States as queen in the aftermath of the Suez Crisis, because we've got all this friction in our relationship now over tariffs,
right,
over the war in Iran, over the role of NATO. And yet King Charles negotiated all that, I thought, pretty well. He gave a really remarkable speech to Congress,
that's right,
as his mother had done, in which he addressed some of these issues. He talked about the importance of NATO. He talked about climate change, something about which he and Trump disagree. He talked about the role of the legislature as a check on the executive, which was perhaps the boldest thing he said in the speech. But he did it in a way with a kind of light touch, respectful touch that didn't draw offense from the White House. So I thought maybe his mother was watching, saying that.
Yeah, exactly. Job. All right, let's say I want to open it up to some questions and give you all a chance to ask Susan too. I'm just, you mentioned Charles and William and Kate, and obviously they learned so much from her over the years, 70 years. What do you think? Did she ever? I guess the question is, did she ever let the mask drop at any time? Did she ever really? Have any kind of huge mistake that will haunt her legacy?
No, I don't.
Never did.
Think so, and isn't that remarkable? Because Carl, I don't know about you, I've made many mistakes.
Yeah.
But she never did something that I think left. Which is
incredible, really, for somebody who was in that.
And she always kept in mind what her role was, which was to serve her country. She never. I think that was, and even at the cost of her personal life, and even at the cost of the personal life of other members of the royal family. Not every member of the royal family seemed willing to make this trade-off, but she was very clear in her own mind what she was put on this earth to do.
Yeah. All right.
First question. Was the Queen ever asked to convey any diplomatic messaging, some substance to some world leader?
Yeah. So here's a story I love. So Kennedy is president, and Kennedy had a big focus on Africa, a bigger focus on Africa than any previous U.S. president. So did the Queen. Africa was very important to Queen Elizabeth, and many important moments in her life she happened to be in Africa. And so while Kennedy is president, President Nkrumah of Ghana, which is a member of the Commonwealth, is being kind of cultivated by the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And the situation in Ghana, it's a member of the Commonwealth, but there's unrest. The Queen Elizabeth's scheduled to make a visit there. He has a bunch of opposition leaders arrested. Some in Great Britain, including Winston Churchill, thinks it's too dangerous for the Queen to go there. She insists on going because she and Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister, and President Kennedy all have an interest in making sure Ghana doesn't become more Soviet than Western, doesn't lose its kind of Western orientation. So she goes on this trip to Ghana. She dances with Nkrumah at the state dinner that night. And this is a time when black people in South Africa are being, at the time of apartheid, there's violence against blacks in South Africa. And here is this white queen dancing with this black leader. And I interviewed a guy who was a child of a Ghanaian official who was in the crowd when she was waving a flag, when her motorcade came through, and whose parents had gone to that state dinner. And the fact that she did that was seen as the biggest possible message to Ghana that helped Ghana stay kind of in the Western orbit. And after when the Queen returned safely to Great Britain, the Prime Minister Macmillan calls Kennedy on their special line and says, "I have risked my Queen. Now you must risk your money." And because the Queen had done that, Kennedy approved millions of dollars in aid to Ghana that he was inclined to not approve, to build a dam on the Upper Volta, because he said that Macmillan had taken the greater risk. And as a result, Ghana had some ups and downs in terms of democracy, but it stayed in the Commonwealth and it became a functioning democracy. And this was an important moment in making that happen. And the Queen, Macmillan and Kennedy and the Queen were all just so delighted that this strategy they had worked out had succeeded.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Another question.
So you've reported on some of the conversations that Trump had with the Queen or whatever, but typically, what were the kinds of conversations that the presidents who are sitting there at the state dinner are having with the Queen?
Can you imagine how good she must have been at small talk?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
actually, with each of the books I've done, so, you do these books and you spend a couple years where you're just obsessed with this person, right? Like, it better be someone you find interesting because they're going to be knocking around in your head. So when I did the Barbara Bush biography, which was the first book I'd written, suddenly I found myself wearing pearls everywhere. It was like, and it wasn't deliberate. It wasn't like a gag. It was like, suddenly pearls seemed to go with every single thing I wore. And for like 2 years, I wore pearls, I'm telling you, 6 days a week. And then once I went on to the next book, suddenly pearls no longer seemed like the perfect accessory. And with the Queen, I became, by the end of this book, I'm historically terrible at small talk. I mean, really awful. You would not want to be seated next to me at any kind of long event. But after doing this book, I am much better at small talk than I was. And the Queen was the world's master at small talk. And I think sometimes it must have been the kind of tortured, where did you go on your summer vacation kind of conversations. But with the presidents she liked, they had real conversations like human beings have, but with someone who has met every world leader who has been around for the past half century. So with the Obamas, I think, for instance, they had a very lively conversation. And in fact, Obama told me when I interviewed him for the book that during that lunch they had where they let Prince Philip drive them, and they made it safely, thank God. At that one where he said they drank quite a bit of beer, actually, at lunch, that the Queen talked to him about how upset she was about Brexit.
Oh.
Now, the Queen, is not supposed to express opinions on politics of the day. And in fact, in the British press, there had been endless speculation about her views on Brexit. But she talked to Obama about how she thought Prime Minister Cameron had screwed that up and should not have had a vote. And that was something when the book came out in April that the British press picked up on. So
She had never made that view public.
yeah, that's right. It had never been clear what her view on Brexit was. And for her to criticize the British Prime Minister to an American president was also seen as pretty scandalous.
Yeah. You mentioned that she was asked, I think, who were the three people that she most... right?
This is such a great...
Yeah.
So Obama, Obama does not give false praise, right? He's not, in that way, he's not really very political. And in fact, it hurt him sometimes in politics that he wouldn't like glad hand fellow Pauls in the way that many politicians do. But when he was giving a eulogy for Shimon Peres, he added to this. I talked to the speechwriter Ben Rhodes, who I think I saw. I think he's coming here to give a speech, give a book talk. Anyway, and he told me that Obama himself put this in the speech. It was not something that Ben Rhodes put in the speech. And Obama said in this eulogy that he had had the privilege to meet 3 giants of the 20th century, and they were Shimon Peres, Nelson Mandela, and Queen Elizabeth.
Wow, wow, wow.
And she once told a friend that she had had the privilege to meet such interesting people as Queen, and she mentioned Mother Teresa and Barack Obama,
Wow.
which is very odd company for each of them, but there you have it.
Okay.
Speaking of British prime ministers, did you have a favorite working relationship or personality-wise with the British prime minister? And to follow up, what was her relationship with Margaret Thatcher like?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So all the prime ministers were great. They were fantastic.
According to her, right.
I think that she liked Macmillan. The British historians would know better than I do. But I think Macmillan and Wilson apparently loved to gossip, and that gave them a connection. I don't think she was that fond of Margaret Thatcher. And I think that she found her policies pretty harsh, even though there was a leaked story about her views of Margaret Thatcher's views as being unkind and too harsh on people. And the palace decried the leak but didn't deny the story. Which I thought was interesting. And I also found this letter. I wish I could remember which president was going to arrive. Maybe it was Reagan. Anyway, a president was going to arrive in Great Britain, and she wrote a letter to Thatcher, who was then prime minister, saying, "I want you to greet him at the airport. I want you to wear a dress and a hat." Is that kind of odd? And I want you to acknowledge receipt of this letter. And then this letter comes back from Margaret Thatcher saying, "Okay, I will greet the president at the airport, and I will be wearing a dress and a hat." But that seems not that friendly to me.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. But my final question, I know we're out of time, but of the presidents you interviewed, who met her, who was the most chatty? Who was the most, effusive about her?
Trump.
Yeah.
Trump's a great interview. You've interviewed Trump.
Yeah.
I've interviewed Trump a couple times. And he is, the thing is, he says, he's very transparent because he says what he thinks about everything from the war in Iran to the reflecting pool to Queen Elizabeth. And as an author, I was grateful.
Susan Page, we're grateful for you. We're grateful for your work and can't wait for the next one. What is the next one going to be about?
I need some suggestions. I don't have.
Okay, folks,
Yeah.
your work is here tonight.
Well, while you're getting your signature from her there, you can tell her what you want the next book to be.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.